Karen always believed she ruled the neighborhood. As head of the HOA, she strutted around the community with an air of untouchable authority, barking orders about lawn lengths, mailbox colors, and driveway cracks. When Jacob moved into his modest ranch-style home on the corner, she expected him to fall in line like everyone else. But Jacob wasn't built to bow to people like her. Quiet, steady, and fiercely independent. He refused HOA membership from the start. At first, Karen's tactics were small. Fines tucked into his mailbox, threatening letters, angry confrontations at the curb. But when Jacob stood firm, her anger grew venomous. Soon, whispers filled the neighborhood about making an example of him. Then one night, Jacob stood on his lawn in stunned silence, flames tearing through his home. Neighbors gasped, fire trucks screamed down the street, and in the shadows, Karen watched with folded arms, lips curled into a self-satisfied smile. What Karen didn't know was that Jacob wasn't just another homeowner. He was a feared federal judge, someone who had brought entire criminal empires to their knees. And now, her petty war had just lit a fire she could never extinguish. Jacob had chosen his home carefully, a modest ranch-style house with a wide porch and a large oak tree out front. To him, it wasn't just a property, it was peace, an escape from the relentless stress of the courtroom. His days as a federal judge were filled with high-stakes decisions, hostile attorneys, and cases that drew national attention. So when he came home, he wanted quiet, not more battles. Unfortunately, Karen, head of the neighborhood HOA, had other plans. From the very first day he moved in, Karen arrived on his doorstep with a clipboard and a smug smile. "You'll need to sign these membership forms," she demanded, her tone leaving no room for discussion. Jacob politely shook his head. "I'm not interested. My property isn't bound by your association. I checked before I bought it." Karen's smile faltered, but her voice sharpened. "Everyone here participates. That's how we maintain standards. If you refuse, you'll regret it." Over the following weeks, her threats turned into action. Letters appeared in his mailbox accusing him of violating rules he was never bound to. One morning, a bright orange paper was taped to his front door. Fine, $500 for improper trash storage. Another week. She claimed his porch light was too dim and slapped on another supposed violation. Jacob, always calm, filed each paper neatly into a folder he labeled harassment. He wasn't the kind of man who lashed out. He believed in patience, in allowing people enough rope to hang themselves. But Karen didn't understand restraint. Soon, Karen's harassment grew public. At HOA meetings, she singled him out, speaking in loud tones so neighbors could hear. "Some people think they're above the rules," she sneered, staring directly at Jacob even though he never attended. Gossip spread, painting him as arrogant, unwilling to be a team player. Neighbors began avoiding him. Children who once waved when he walked his dog now hurried away at their parents' urging. Mailmen delivered his letters quickly, almost nervously. Karen had poisoned the well, and Jacob's quiet corner of peace was turning into hostile ground. But Jacob wasn't a man easily broken. Each morning he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise over the roofs of the neighborhood. His golden retriever sat faithfully at his side, tail thumping gently. Karen would drive past in her pristine SUV, slowing just enough to glare. He would meet her gaze, unflinching, a calm defiance that only enraged her more. One evening, as the sky turned shades of lavender, Jacob overheard Karen speaking loudly on her phone in front of his house. "He thinks he can ignore me? I'll show him what happens when someone disrespects my HOA." Her voice dripped with venom. Jacob didn't rise. He didn't respond. Instead, he opened his notebook and wrote down every word. What Karen didn't realize was that this wasn't just a stubborn neighbor she was dealing with. It was a man who had dismantled criminal syndicates, prosecuted corrupt officials, and sentenced dangerous people to life. Karen thought she was starting a petty war. In reality, she was lighting a fuse she couldn't control, and though Jacob didn't know it yet, the fire she promised would soon become terrifyingly real. Karen's obsession with Jacob deepened quickly. What had begun as petty fines and open insults morphed into something darker. She wasn't satisfied with just inconveniencing him. She wanted him broken, humiliated, forced to bend to her authority. It started small. One night, Jacob awoke to the sound of his trash can clattering across the street. He stepped outside, robe wrapped tightly around him, and spotted Karen's silhouette hurrying away. The next morning, a letter appeared in his mailbox. Violation. Unsightly trash placement. Jacob simply picked up the can, placed it back neatly, and returned to his porch. He filed the violation with the others, his calm unshaken. But Karen wasn't done. Weeks later, Jacob noticed patches of his lawn dying in strange square shapes. At first, he thought it was bad soil, until he caught Karen in the dead of night, sprinkling something from a plastic bag across his grass. Her face was twisted in a sneer as she scattered the substance, convinced she wasn't seen. Jacob didn't confront her. Instead, he quietly recorded it with his phone from an upstairs window. Evidence. Karen grew bolder. She began knocking on his door at odd hours, demanding he pay fees. When Jacob ignored her, she stood in his yard and shouted at the top of her lungs. Neighbors peeked through blinds, some entertained, others frightened, but no one dared intervene. Karen ran the HOA like a petty kingdom, and they were her subjects. One evening, Jacob returned home to find his mailbox smashed, the metal bent inward like it had been struck with a bat. A bright yellow sticky note fluttered from the wreckage. Join or leave. Jacob's golden retriever barked furiously, tail rigid, sensing his owner's tension. For the first time, Jacob allowed himself a moment of frustration. He clenched the note in his fist, his jaw tight. Still, he didn't lash out. Patience. Always patience. Karen, however, took his silence as weakness. At the next HOA meeting, she raised her voice even louder. This man refuses to respect our community. He refuses to pay his dues, and worse, he thinks he's above all of you. Do we want people like that living here? The crowd murmured. Some nodded reluctantly, not wanting Karen's wrath. Others looked uneasy but stayed quiet. Fear kept them compliant. Jacob sat at home during this spectacle, sipping his coffee, while his phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. Some apologized privately. Sorry, Jacob, we know she's out of line, but we can't cross her. Jacob only replied with a simple, thank you. Stay safe. But he couldn't ignore the escalation anymore. He installed cameras around his property, subtle but sharp-eyed, recording everything. The folder labeled harassment grew thicker, and still, Jacob waited, building his case. Because deep down, he knew. Bullies like Karen always pushed too far. And when they did, they crossed a line they could never uncross. Karen's obsession didn't cool with time. It blazed hotter. Jacob's refusal to bend made her look weak in front of her subjects, and weakness wasn't something she tolerated. She had to crush him, no matter the cost. One morning, Jacob woke to find the words, "HOA rules or else," spray-painted in thick black strokes across the side of his barn. The paint dripped in ugly streaks, glaring against the red wooden boards. His dog barked at the vandalism, pacing restlessly, while Jacob stood silently, hands in his pockets, watching the sunrise paint the sky behind the damage. Instead of anger, he felt only certainty. Karen was spiraling. That night, the situation turned dangerous. Jacob had just settled into bed when he smelled smoke. His dog leapt up growling, ears sharp. Jacob shot out of bed and saw it, the flicker of flames licking the corner of his wooden fence. He sprinted outside, grabbed the hose, and doused it before the fire spread. The smell of gasoline clung heavy in the air. Someone had tried to set it ablaze, and Jacob knew exactly who. The following day, he found burnt rags discarded near the fence line. The kind used to make crude Molotovs. He bagged them carefully, his expression calm, methodical, before storing them with the rest of his evidence. But Karen was growing sloppy. The neighbors whispered. Some even started avoiding her. One woman, Mrs. Alvarez, caught Jacob at the grocery store. "She's gone too far," she whispered, voice trembling. "We're afraid, but we see what she's doing to you. Just be careful." Jacob offered her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'm handling it." But the truth was, Karen was preparing for something far worse. A week later, Jacob was jolted awake in the dead of night by his dog's frantic barking. He bolted upright, heart pounding, and glanced out his window. What he saw turned his blood cold. Flames roared across his porch, climbing up the walls of his ranch house. The orange glow illuminated the street like a macabre beacon. Neighbors stood outside in their pajamas, horrified, whispering among themselves, but none dared approach. And in the middle of the chaos, silhouetted against the fire's glow, Jacob spotted her, Karen, standing tall, her arms crossed. Her face twisted in grim satisfaction as his home burned. Jacob's dog barked at her. The sound raw and furious, but Karen didn't flinch. She only smirked, her power on full display. Jacob grabbed his dog, rushed outside, and dragged the garden hose across the yard, spraying desperately. But the fire was too big. Within minutes, his house was engulfed, flames cracking and windows shattering. His chest tightened, his mind racing, not in panic, but in resolve. Karen thought she had won, but she had no idea who she was truly dealing with. Jacob stood in the yard, the fire's heat searing his face. His dog pressed protectively to his leg. Behind him, his life's possessions turned to ash, and still he didn't scream. He didn't beg. He simply stared at Karen across the street, their eyes locking in the glow of the inferno. And in that silence, Jacob knew. This was the line. And Karen had just crossed into a battle she couldn't possibly win. The morning after the fire, Jacob stood on the charred remains of his porch, ash clinging to his boots, the smell of smoke still heavy in the air. His ranch house, his sanctuary, was gone. Only blackened beams and collapsed walls remained. His golden retriever pressed close against his leg, whimpering softly, sensing his pain. Karen strolled by in broad daylight, her face smug as if she were admiring a piece of art. "Maybe you'll think twice before rejecting the HOA now," she sneered, loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear. Jacob didn't answer. He only studied her, his expression unreadable, hands buried deep in his jean pockets. To Karen, his silence looked like defeat. To Jacob, it was calculation. That evening, Jacob drove into town, his pickup rumbling down the empty road. But instead of heading to a hotel or relative's home, he pulled into a nondescript government building. Inside, the sterile fluorescent lights revealed a stark truth. Jacob wasn't just any rancher. He entered a secured office, greeted by colleagues who addressed him not as Jacob, but Judge Harrington. Federal Judge Jacob Harrington. The same man who had sentenced powerful CEOs, politicians, and even cartel leaders. A man whose rulings made national headlines. A man feared, even in Washington. Karen had no idea the neighbor she was tormenting was one of the most respected and feared judges in the country. Jacob sat at his desk, pulling out the evidence he'd quietly collected over the weeks. Photos of vandalism, charred rags soaked in gasoline, surveillance footage from a hidden camera by the barn. He assembled it all into a file, methodical and precise. His colleagues offered him quiet nods of support, one muttering, "She won't see what's coming." Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, Karen reveled in her supposed victory. She hosted a backyard party, wineglass in hand, boasting to her loyal followers. "I told you he'd break. No one resists the HOA. No one." Laughter echoed across the yard, though a few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. The fire had been too much, too cruel, and her behavior unsettled them. But Karen didn't notice the shifting tides. She was too drunk on her own triumph. The next morning, Jacob returned. He parked his truck in front of the burned-out house and calmly set up a temporary shelter on the property, unfazed by the ruins. Neighbors whispered, watching him hammer stakes and secure tarps, his movements steady, deliberate. Karen stormed over, red-faced. "What do you think you're doing?" she barked. "Rebuilding," Jacob said simply, without looking at her. "This property is condemned," she shrieked. "The HOA won't allow you to stay here." Jacob finally turned to her, his voice low, his eyes sharp. "We'll see about that." The word sent a shiver through Karen, though she couldn't explain why. What she didn't know was that Judge Harrington had already filed a federal injunction that very morning, citing harassment, arson, and abuse of power. Soon, every HOA board member in the county would receive a subpoena. Karen thought she had crushed Jacob. In reality, she had awakened a storm she could never control. The neighborhood began to stir uneasily. Jacob's quiet defiance unsettled people. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't threatened. He simply remained, calmly rebuilding on the same ashes that Karen had celebrated. His composure made Karen nervous, though she masked it with louder accusations. At a hastily called HOA meeting in Karen's backyard, she stood at the head of a long folding table, waving papers in the air. "He's trespassing on condemned land. We cannot allow him to stay," she shouted. A few die-hard supporters clapped, but most neighbors sat silently, shifting uncomfortably. One neighbor finally spoke up. "Karen, isn't it a little much? The fire, the constant harassment. People are talking. They're saying this has gone too far." Karen's face flushed crimson. "Too far? He broke our rules. Rules are what keep our community safe." But her words rang hollow. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The fire had scared people. And now, seeing Jacob quietly rebuild while Karen ranted, they began questioning who the real problem was. That evening, Jacob sat by the temporary fire pit he'd built, the golden retriever curled at his side. The dog's harness glimmered faintly in the firelight. Neighbors passed slowly by, some pausing to offer quiet nods of sympathy, others dropping off small supplies, a hammer, a bundle of wood, even a warm meal. Jacob accepted each gift with gratitude, never boasting, never pressing. Karen watched from her window, seething. The power she had wielded for years was slipping away, her iron grip loosening as Jacob's calm strength drew others to him. But Jacob wasn't done. The very next morning, a courier delivered thick envelopes to every board member's doorstep. Inside were official federal subpoenas with Judge Harrington's seal. Charges: harassment, arson, abuse of authority, conspiracy. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors gasped as men in suits with government badges began visiting homes, asking questions, collecting evidence. Karen stormed over to Jacob's property, clutching the subpoena in her trembling hands. "You think you can scare us with this paperwork?" she spat, though her voice cracked. Jacob stood tall, his plaid shirt streaked with ash, his dog beside him. His eyes were sharp, his jaw firm. "This isn't fear, Karen, this is justice." For the first time, Karen faltered. She took a step back, the spray of venom she usually carried replaced by silence. That night, she gathered the HOA board members in her living room, desperate, pacing like a caged animal. "We can fight this." "He's bluffing!" she insisted. But the others sat pale and silent, gripping their subpoenas. One finally whispered, "Karen, he's a federal judge." The color drained from Karen's face. Her wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. By morning, the neighborhood was no longer whispering. It was buzzing. The sight of government officials moving briskly through the quiet cul-de-sacs had rattled everyone. For years, Karen's word had been law, her rules unchallenged. Now it was her signature on the subpoena that neighbors stared at with wide eyes. Jacob walked his service dog down the street, head high, calm as ever. Neighbors who once avoided him now stepped forward. "Jacob," one man said, pressing a firm hand on his shoulder. "We're with you. We didn't know how far Karen had gone." Jacob only nodded, his expression soft but unreadable. "It's not about me. It's about right and wrong. All of us deserve better." At the HOA clubhouse that evening, a mandatory emergency meeting was called. Karen arrived late, her floral blouse wrinkled, her hair frazzled from sleepless nights. She stormed into the room, slamming the subpoena onto the table. "This is nonsense!" she barked. "We cannot let one man destroy everything we've built." But this time she wasn't met with applause. Instead, murmurs filled the room. A woman at the back rose, trembling but resolute. "Karen, my children were terrified by that fire. We can't pretend anymore. You've gone too far." Karen's face twisted. "You think he's innocent?" "He's manipulating you! You'll regret siding with him." But her tirade was cut short as heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. A team of federal marshals entered, their black suits and polished shoes unmistakable. The room fell silent. "Karen Miller?" the lead officer asked, voice booming. Karen's knees buckled slightly, but she straightened. This is harassment! You can't... But she could barely finish before she was handed an arrest warrant. Her hands shook as the paper fluttered. For the first time, she was not the accuser, but the accused. Jacob entered moments later, his presence calm, commanding. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped to the front. Years of intimidation, abuse, and outright crimes. "End here," he said firmly. "The HOA isn't above the law," gasps echoed. The revelation rippled through the crowd. A neighbor whispered what everyone was beginning to realize. "He's a federal judge." Karen's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Her once loyal board sat frozen, unable to meet her eyes. The marshals moved closer. Karen backed away, panic overtaking her bravado. "You don't understand. I was protecting this neighborhood," she cried, but her words had lost their weight. The neighbors who once feared her now stared with cold clarity. They saw not a leader, but a tyrant finally unmasked. As she was escorted out, Karen's gaze flicked toward Jacob, eyes blazing with humiliation. But Jacob didn't flinch. His hand rested lightly on his dog's harness, his other hand resting steady at his side. The weight of justice carried him forward. That night, the cul-de-sac was quieter than it had been in years. Neighbors gathered around Jacob's property, helping him clear debris, offering food, tools, and support. For the first time, they weren't under the thumb of Karen's fear. They were free. Karen's arrest sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet neighborhood. News vans rolled in, cameras flashed, and headlines screamed about the HOA leader charged in federal judge's case. Neighbors who once cowered in silence now stepped forward, telling stories of fines, harassment, and fear that had ruled their lives for years. Jacob, however, stayed grounded. He didn't bask in the attention. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his ranch brick by brick. Each swing of his hammer was steady, deliberate. His golden retriever stayed close, watchful, and loyal, as if guarding both Jacob and the new beginning rising from the ashes. One afternoon, as Jacob worked on framing the new walls, a neighbor approached shyly with her young son. "Mr. Harrington," she said softly, "we never had the courage to speak up before." "Thank you for standing up for all of us." Jacob crouched, meeting the boy's eyes with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the hardest thing is finding your voice. But once you do, no one can silence it again." The neighborhood, once fractured by fear, began to transform. Without Karen's grip, families planted gardens, children played freely on sidewalks, and people gathered for cookouts and bonfires. Where suspicion and intimidation had lived, trust and friendship grew. Karen, meanwhile, faced trial for arson, harassment, and abuse of power. Her name, once spoken with authority, became a cautionary tale whispered with disdain. She had underestimated Jacob, never realizing that beneath his quiet exterior was a man whose authority reached far beyond their cul-de-sac. The day his house was fully rebuilt, neighbors gathered for a celebration. Lights strung across the yard glowed warmly as laughter filled the air. A long table was covered in dishes everyone had brought, homemade pies, casseroles, and even Karen's former allies contributing with a sense of redemption. As dusk settled, Jacob stood at the center, his dog at his side, and addressed the crowd. "Community isn't built on rules written in stone," he said, his voice carrying steady and clear. "It's built on respect, compassion, and fairness. We don't need fear to live together, we need trust." Applause erupted. Some wiped away tears, others clapped until their hands were sore. For the first time in years, the neighborhood truly felt united. Later that night, as the fire pit glowed under a sky filled with stars, Jacob sat quietly with his dog. The weight of the past months pressed on him, but so did a deep sense of peace. He had faced down cruelty, loss, and betrayal, but in the end, justice had prevailed. And though Karen's shadow had loomed large, it was gone now, replaced by a light that would guide the community forward. The HOA had learned a bitter lesson. Power abused always collapses. And in its place, something stronger always rises.